Hello, everyone. I tell you, those photographs of Portugal make me want to go right back there. I'm Karen MacNeil, author of The Wine Bible and editor of the digital newsletter Wine Speed. And this is a live virtual tasting on the wines of a place you may not yet know, but I hope you will after this live virtual tasting. And those are the delicious wines of Monção and Melgaço. Somewhat affectionately known around this office as M&M, but it's really not that hard to say, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Monção and Melgaço, by the way, is in the Vino Verde region of northern Portugal, which I know is very familiar to probably everyone watching. So thank you for being here. If this is your first time, welcome. If you've been with us before, we thank you for being back. And I want to begin this evening by saying that Portugal is in many ways an enigma. It is, of course, a part of modern Europe, but it's also a place that is just fiercely wedded to tradition. In June, I went to Portugal on vacation, and I discovered the fantastic wines of Monção and Melgaço, which I now think of as sort of super Vino Verdes. Let me introduce my co-host for the evening, sommelier Erik Segelbaum. Erik, there you are. Yep, I know you share a passion for Portuguese wines in general with me. And I thought what we might do before we begin and before we start tasting wines and introducing those wines is just quickly, once again, put up the map of Portugal so everyone can sort of fix in their mind. Music at the same time, once again. Here we see Monção and Melgaço in the Vino Verde region of northern Portugal. And what's important, I think, to know is that Vino Verde is a fairly large region. It looks like Ireland. It does not look like what you might think of as Portugal. And there are about 9 different regions within Vino Verde, but Monção and Melgaço is one of the most northern, driest, and sunniest. And Erik and I will talk about the effect that has on the wines in a moment. Okay, should we dive in?
Let's do it.
All right. So before we start tasting, Erik, I want to ask you what your take is on the Monção wines. Like when someone says Monção and Melgaço, what do you, I mean, you might start salivating, right? But what's your initial take?
So I don't like to play favorites. One of my least loved questions as a sommelier is, what's your favorite wine, right? So whenever I'm looking at a region or an appellation, and there's a particular sub-region or sub-appellation or parcel that stands out, I sort of struggle with the idea of having a favorite. I love Vino Verde across the board, but I believe of all the sub-regions, Monção and Melgaço is it's the Grand Cru, if you'll allow me to borrow the term. All of my favorite Vino Verdes consistently come from Monção and Melgaço, and this is blind tasting, not knowing where they're from. There's no bias, informed or otherwise. There is something so magical about the terroir of this subregion, and frankly, I mean, that's why we're talking about it. We're not doing a live on one of the other regions. It's because this is one that really bears focus. It really deserves it. You know, I also, another thing I hate that I'm going to do is comparing everything to France, right? We all love to compare, like, oh, this tastes like the Rhone Valley. This tastes like, no, I hate doing that. But as an amalgam, when I think about Monção and Melgaço, I think about the Burgundy and sub-appellations, and like, to me, this is like what Chablis Grand Cru or Premier Cru is to Burgundy, Monção and Melgaço is to Vino Verde.
Oh, yikes, that's a big statement. But I think I'm pretty with you here because, I mean, the words that come to me are, you know, crushed minerals and incredible racy freshness and almost a sea salt crunchy acidity and just this lime zest bullet train coming through the wines, all of which, it's hot here in the Napa Valley right now, and I'm drinking these wines, and they taste just perfect, given the temperatures of summer. But really, I love refreshing wines any time of year. Let's talk about grape varieties for a second, because people may not realize that Portugal has first of all, it has about 350 grape varieties, 250 of which are indigenous grape varieties that were probably Phoenician in origin, because you don't see these grape varieties in other parts of Western Europe. Phoenicia, right? The old area that is today mostly Lebanon, but Lebanon, Syria, Israel, that part of the Near East. And one of those varieties, Alvarinho, is the leading variety here. So it's also known as Alvarinho in Spain. So tell me your thoughts about Alvarinho flavor, Erik.
Well, I have to say, at nearly 2 decades of being a sommelier, my thoughts on Alvarinho changed dramatically in the last few years, given some intensive immersion in Vino Verde, visiting multiple times and tasting the wines. When we're studying, we've got like, this is what Alvarinho tastes like. It's, mandarin blossom and, definitely bright, high acidity and some citrus notes. But like, if you don't get that sort of sort of tangerine mandarin note, like maybe it's something else, right? That's what we're taught in the conventional sommelier school world, what Alvarinho is. But then when you taste the wines from Monção and Melgaço, from one vineyard to the next, from one estate to the next, I mean, Alvarinho is the most important grape of that region, and you realize how immensely versatile it is. And this is why I likened it to Burgundy. Not that I'm saying they taste the same, but with how variated Chardonnay can be depending on where you are in Burgundy, so too can Alvarinho be in Vino Verde. And Monção and Melgaço, to me, produces the best of the best.
Yeah, when we think of that region, and we did see some wonderful beauty shots right in the beginning, but I think when you and I hear the words mountains, dry, and sunny, we're already thinking, okay, yeah, this is going to be really good, right? So translate, I'll say what that means for me after you say what that means for you. Mountains, dry, and sunny.
All right. Mountains, I'm thinking high elevation. High elevation means bigger changes in temperature from day to night, cooler in general. It takes longer to get warmer. It gets colder more quickly, which prolongs the ripening season. So if I think about flavor as a tangible shape. So if flavor is a sphere, it might be soccer ball sized at, sea level and beach ball sized at elevation. The color and the shape are the same, but just the intensity of it changes. So first of all, high elevation, fresh, longer ripening period, more phenolic development. So just more complexity and flavor going on for sure. Dry, when vines struggle, to quote a friend of mine, a fantastic sommelier, Peter Neptune, he says all the time, vines don't care that you make wine from its grapes. That's not a vine's reason to live. A vine's purpose is, or any plant's purpose is just to propagate its genetic progeny. And vines, much like people, I am not a parent, but for those of you that are, I would imagine that if you're in a situation where you're resource starved and either your kids eat or you eat, most parents are going to feed their kids. Well, vine is the same way with its grapes. So when we're looking at a dry region where water is potentially limited, then the vine is going to put all of that energy into its grapes, its genetic progeny, its future. And we take those grapes and we crush them and we turn them into wine. So it just simply means that we get better juice from it. Now wait, what was the third factor? We had high elevation, dry, and
sunny.
And sunny, right? So sunny, we're talking about sugar development, and let's just reiterate: sugar at harvest has nothing to do with sweetness of a wine whatsoever, right? Remember 5th grade chemistry: yeast eats sugar, gives us alcohol and CO2, right? So sugar ripeness at harvest is wildly important when we're talking about balance, alcoholic balance, not too alcoholic, not too lean, but also sunny means we're getting so much purity of fruit and amplification of fruit. I can see you just fine. I'm a moderately sunny region. I put these on, it's sharp, it's focused. That's a very sunny region.
Beautifully said. And to which I will only add, because I agree with all of those, and I couldn't have said it more beautifully than you did. But I think sun also gives us body, right? Remember in the old days, I'm older than you, so I remember the day when some Vino Verdes, at least some that came into this country, were pretty lightweight wines. No one thought very much about them. They were, considered just quaffers, and that was that. I'm not sure wines from Monção and Melgaço came in those days, but these wines have real gravitas. They have some weight on the palate. And I think that also comes from sun.
I absolutely agree.
All right. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm saying 100%. I agree. In thinking about wine in general, we tend to forget that wine is not just the sum of its parts, but it can be more than that. With certain wines, 1 + 1 = 2. With some wines, 1 + 1 = 50. And one of the things I love about Monção and Melgaço is that exponential equation.
Beautifully said. All right, let's do some tasting here because, as befits wines that are racy and crisp, these wines are in sleek flute bottles. They almost never have a big impact of oak, and usually not any impact of oak at all, which I think underscores their freshness and the beauty and purity of their fruit. We're going to start with this wine, which is the De la Deux Reserva, and this is a 2020. I was knocked out. I've tasted this wine now a couple of times. I was so knocked out by it. I just love its sort of movement on the palate. It has so much energy.
I love that you talk in the tangible abstract, because the term energy, right? I think that's more of a visceral feeling, right? Because what is that like? Energy, we know what it means electrical wise, but when it comes to individuals drinking wine, we all have our, I would imagine, fairly similar understanding of energy. And I think that's absolutely perfectly expressed in this wine, right? It's almost like an electricity, like you feel like a tangible tingle on your tongue. And that's not it's not because it's an old school style of Vino Verde that might have purposeful slight little spritz, but there's like a verve, or I believe the term that you use, because your book is what made me pass my sommelier exams. Nervosity, what I believe was the term that you taught me in writing. But it's just got so much going on that cannot be attributed to flavor. Like we can talk about the citrus notes. We can talk about the gentle sort of like leafy floral notes. But then there's this whole other section of flavor that's more feeling than tangibly describable taste. And I think energy is the most perfect way to describe that. And that's one of the things that draws me always to Monção and Melgaço.
Yeah, I'm with you. You're a sommelier and I'm a writer, and both of us have to occasionally speak for a living. And so we know how language in a way fails us, right? And every wine drinker knows that when you taste a wine that is beautiful, you know what you're experiencing, but man, it is so hard to put it into words. So I don't know, as far as I'm concerned, any good word works if it helps you kind of hold a memory of the wine and place it in kind of the constellation of wines in your mind. So De la Deux, fabulous energy, lots of minerality. What do you think minerality is, by the way?
Oh, are we going to open that Pandora's box of worms?
Just a little bit, just what you think.
All right. So I'll say this much. You see these nerd glasses. I am a man of science. I earned them. I love scientific everything. I understand full well that there is no scientifically provable corollary between types of rock or stone and flavor. That being said, I can tell you as a sommelier for nearly 2 decades that minerality is 100% in my world a thing. And in some cases, it's the only thing, the type of mineral impression is the only thing that takes me from one appellation to another. So first of all, yes, I believe minerality is absolutely a thing. Secondly, I believe it's present in extremes in not just this wine, but in wines in Monção and Melgaço across the board. And I'm not at home, otherwise I would have this prep, but I have a number of different rocks. You know the whole like take only pictures, leave only footsteps. Yeah, no, I take rocks. So I have rocks from all sorts of different vineyards. And when I was in Vino Verde, I took some rocks from Monção and Melgaço, and I took some rocks from some other regions, and they're different. And it really expresses itself in the wines. So there's a stoniness. Like if we're looking at this first wine, there's a stoniness, but more deeply. This to me is almost like a crushed river rock kind of situation, versus when we get into some of the other wines, that minerality takes on a different approach. So like I said, I believe minerality is a thing, even though I might not fully understand it. I don't really fully understand particle physics, but I know that there's truth to it. So I'm willing to accept a certain degree of gray area, but yeah, there's this sort of like that salinity and crushed river rock situation here. Kind of reminds me of like camping on a beach.
All right. We've got two great questions coming in. I'll take the last one first. Teresa is asking, what do you think is providing that energy? You know, Teresa, the easy answer that people sometimes say is acidity, because acidity has a kind of verve and freshness to it. But I actually think it's more than acidity, because lots of wines have acidity. Like Erik, I think that there's much of what we truly love about wine hasn't been explained by science. The fact that it hasn't been explained by science doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means it hasn't been explained yet. So what is a sense of aliveness? I don't know how I would say what is contributing to that, but I know for a fact that I could put in front of you, Teresa, a wine that I believe to be sort of dead and a wine that possesses that sense of energy and almost animate beingness, a wine that really talks to you. So that's where we are on that. But Edie also, who was with us, Erik, when we did the Vino Verde tasting, is saying, can you, and I want to throw this question to you because I know you love this wine, can you compare this De la Deux to the Solero Vino Verde we tasted a couple of weeks ago? What would you say? Because I know you really like both of these wines.
I really do. Okay, so the Solero to me was much more in the lemon citrus kingdom, and a little bit more salty, like green olive, caper brine, or like caper berry. And the minerality there was much more chalky for me. This wine is pitching a little bit more to the orange and grapefruit version of things, you know, tangerine, mandarin, a little bit of really like pink grapefruit, not like white. And the florality to this, to me, is a little bit more yellow flower rather than white flower. This is more like, it's not honeyed, because honey, now we're talking about botrytis and late harvest and all that stuff. There's no honey tone, but it reminds me of honeysuckle and some yellow flowers. But we're like splitting hairs on distinctions, because I believe if you were to sort of put them into flavor boxes, these both would exist in the same box. And then we're just sort of waving in the current of what's inside that box.
Yeah, and I think if you had them both at, let's say, I don't know, both at dinner and just a glass of each, I can imagine myself, I would keep going back and forth to both of these wines, because they're satisfying some elemental desire for the same kind of beauty, raciness, mineraliness, sea saltness, ocean freshness. I think they're both doing that.
So
go ahead.
How geeky and abstract can we get here?
I think you can keep going.
All right. These wines have a similar IQ, but a very different personality, right? The IQ doesn't tell you anything about personality, but it's a tie that binds. So that would be my somewhat geeky abstract version of how to compare the two.
Erik, I'm going to really think about that. Don't tell me I have to steal a line of yours now, but
Oh my
I'm
God, that would be a career dream of mine. Please take it. It's yours. It's yours.
all right. We got to keep going here, my friend. Let's taste the Portal do Fidalgo. Let me hold this up so that everyone can see it. This is also a 2020. And I want to say that one of the things, we're still in the world of Alvarinho, of course, one of the things that Portuguese white table grapes are known for is pretty magical. And that is that scientists say that they have learned, and they actually use that word learned, to hold on to their acidity, that they've evolved over centuries in a relatively warm climate to actually hold that acidity and not respire it off. So we're again in the world of lots of freshness. Although I think this wine for me, let me take a look at my notes here, is maybe a little mellower, not quite as, I want to say geographic on the palate, a little bit more spherical. Your take?
No, I would absolutely agree. You know, when you're talking about holding on to the acidity and the freshness, I would agree with that statement, but I would also suggest if we look at production in Vino Verde and specifically Monção and Melgaço, I think maybe once I tried a wine that saw like 20% oak, if that. So like we don't see oak, we rarely see mallow, we rarely see batonnage, and these are three things that basically soften the sharp edges of acidity, or in this case, the brightness and the freshness of it. So I would agree that Alvarinho as a high acid grape, it's always going to be there. But unlike other high acid grapes like Chardonnay, for example, or Sauvignon Blanc that often in Bordeaux and California sees oak, I think it's partially the variety, partially the impact of the region, but also partially the terroir of that region. You know, we talk about terroir as being, most people think it's the dirt, which like, yeah, that's important, but it's not just the soil, it's the climate, micro, meso, macro climate, the slope, the aspect, all that stuff. But we forget, or we tend to not want to acknowledge that terroir is also winemaking. And in the old world, winemaking is regulated. And so if you just look at the laws and the rules of either what can and can't be done, or what historically, because, you know, a wine region like Monção and Melgaço, we're talking about generations and on generations versus maybe some of the New World wine regions that might be decades and maybe now passing to second, like look at Washington State, we're passing to second, third generation versus Monção and Melgaço, we're 10 plus generations, right? So I think it's part of that terroir is the winemaking traditions that are either mandated by law or kept by tradition that are limiting or eliminating the things that would maybe flatten, dull, or soften that bright, vivacious, sharp, and fresh acidity. So I agree with the scientific statement, but I also think there's a little bit of the terroir of winemaking involved in that too.
Yeah, and you're so right to bring up tradition, because it can be the handcuffs on a European winemaker. Many of them will say that, but it can also be very freeing, because now you're working in a defined set of parameters. And now when you have that defined set of parameters, the place really does talk. The place has to talk because you're holding all other variables constant. So it's both I suppose, a blessing and a curse a bit. Tasting this Portal again, I'm also, sometimes when you have saltiness or spiciness, I think of, when you see kids with a mason jar catching fireflies, and then those little fireflies in the summer kind of going off in the jar. And that's how I think that sometimes white pepper and saltiness work through a wine. They're like little fireflies, I don't know, sparking off and adding a kind of kinesthetic feel to the wine, right? It's texture. It's not just flavor. It's not, as you, I think, beautifully point out, lemon, pink grapefruit, tangerine, but it's the textural element that's compelling. And that goes back to something that you pointed out earlier that Chablis does as well. Talk about that. As a sommelier, how important is texture to you?
Oh, massively important. And if, you know, for anyone who's watching who's like unsure of texture, the way I like to analogize that, I'm big on analogies, is I want you all to imagine milk. Forget the flavors of milk. Just imagine the weight, body, richness, mouthfeel, or lack thereof between skim milk, 2%, whole milk, half and half, and heavy cream. That is how I understand texture, right? Just the feel of that liquid in your mouth and how quickly it spreads or how unctuous it is or isn't. To me, texture is everything. As a sommelier, we're taught to largely quantify things. Acid is only low, medium, minus, medium, plus, or high. Sugar is only, tannins are only, but frankly, like high tannin is one thing, but the quality of those tannins, even though there's no tannins in this wine, are they creamy, chalky, rich, astringent, powdery, dry, right? That to me is far more important when I'm blind tasting and figuring out a wine than is it high tannin? You know, like perfect example, Nebbiolo, high tannin, Napa Cab, high tannin. Those things are completely different qualitatively, but quantifiably very similar. So same when it comes to wines like this and when it comes to texture, I think the qualifiers are far more important than the quantifiers. And case in point, this wine, I did cheat. It's not like I have this memorized. 7.1 grams per liter of TA or tradable acidity or total acidity. That is pretty high acid.
Very high acid. That's more than champagne, actually.
Right, but it doesn't feel that way. We were talking about a richness of this, a texture in this, which I completely agree with. So despite the fact that scientifically, quantifiably, the acidity is close to off the charts, the quality of the wine in general and how that acid presents itself, very, very different. And I know you speak to this a lot, and it's one of the things that I think more people need to get comfortable with talking about, because, you know, red is measurable. Shades of red, a little less so. Feelings of red, even less so. Qualify over quantify. For me, that's everything when it comes to nuances of wine, and it's what makes wine so exciting for me.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, so we have, I don't know, we have minerals, we have fireflies, we have oceanic freshness. So the point, though, even before we get to wine number 3, is Monção and Melgaço is a very, it's really worthy, I think, of people's attention. Because if these were merely simple wines, we'd be like, okay, done and dusted, 2 sentences, done, over. But that's not the case here. I'm very excited that these wines are starting to come in greater numbers into the US just now. I mean, it hasn't been true in the past. So let's go to the VALADOS de Melgaço. Let me hold this wine up. If you are Portuguese, I apologize for my poor Portuguese pronunciation. This is a 2019. Wanda is asking, by the way, why is the wine so clear or very light in color? Some of that may be because these wines are not aged in oak. The other part of that is that, of course, every grape variety, just like every person, has genetically a coloration to their skin. And Alvarinho is a light-skinned grape. Erik, you want to jump in on that at all?
I mean, to me, that's most of it. It's light skin. B, white wines, especially in Monção and Melgaço, are not made with any kind of skin contact. But also, you're talking, I believe Wanda's question was about the PROVAM, the Portal de Fidalgo. So that's a 2020. That's relatively young. I mean, if you think about that wine was harvested 2 years ago, next month-ish, and probably spent, I don't know, I'm guessing 8 months or so, 9 months in stainless steel after a few weeks of fermentation. So we're talking about something that's only really been on market for a year, and, made it without oak in a non-oxidative way, that then, that color just doesn't come out. White wines, as they get older, get more colorful. Red wines, as they get older, get less colorful. And actually, since we just poured it, if you look at the VALADOS de Melgaço, I don't know if you have these wines in front of you, Wanda, but you can see this is a much more sort of richly yellow toned. And that's just, this is a 2019. It's got a little bit more age and perhaps made in a more oxidative style.
You know, we should say though too, and Wanda, you may already realize this, of course, but I think one of the things that we in the business always are guarding ourselves and making sure we do not make this assumption, and that is it's a natural tendency to think that wines that are darker in color, more powerful in color, will be more powerful in flavor. And that is not true. Color and flavor intensity are not correlated, not related. You can have the lightest colored Riesling in the world that can be just galvanizing and just riveting. Same with Alvarinho. The light color is not a reflection of the intensity of the wine's flavor. Yeah.
Thank you for speaking to that, Karen, because I will tell you, one of the more frustrating recurring interactions of my days in restaurants as a restaurant sommelier, which I am no longer, with consumers, is a misassociation of color with some other property of the wine. I can't tell you how many times I would pour a red wine to proof and they'd be like, oh, look at that color. That's going to be full bodied and great. I'm like, no, that just means it's pigmented. That doesn't mean anything. So I'm so very glad that you spoke to that, because
this is why I'm not a sommelier, because I would have been like, hey, bud, come on. These things are not related. Never mind.
There are delicate ways to handle that.
All right. And we got to talk food, Erik, because Monção and Melgaço wines have a huge range for food. Where do you instinctively go with food?
Okay. I instinctively avoid the easy, low-hanging fruit of mollusks, crustaceans, oysters, mussels, whatever. There's plenty of that in Monção and Melgaço. And the wines go really well with that. I mean, they're on the Minho River, they're close to the Atlantic Ocean. There's a lot of sea influence there and incredible stuff. Bacalhau, ironically, cod isn't even Portuguese. That's not coming from anywhere near there, but you know, salted cod and all that stuff. These wines inherently and instinctively go well with that because of that, you know, like the two things we put on fish: citrus, salt, right? These are citrusy and saline. That's the low-hanging fruit. But what I don't think people realize is how food-friendly and versatile Monção and Melgaço wines are. These are the wines that locals within the Vino Verde region are eating with grilled pork, with sausages, with lamb. I mean, there's, you know, and forgive me, I can't remember the exact name of what they call it, but, you know, we all think about Iberico Bellota, the acorn-fed Spanish jamon. I mean, the Iberian Peninsula is defined by modern definitions of borders, but Spain and Portugal are the same place in terms of, you know, sort of the ancient world. And that whole acorn-fed, beautiful, like dark marbled pig-based charcuterie, that's as much a thing in Vino Verde as it is in Spain. And this is like the Monção and Melgaço is like the quintessential pairing with like shaved jamon, and I'm forgetting the Portuguese term for it, please forgive me, but also like the Portuguese blood sausage and charcuterie and like really lamb. Like if you think white wine and fish and poultry and red wine and meat is the gospel, that's a stalwart from an ancient generation. Wines like this, again, think about the number one thing we put on meats or proteins, animal proteins: citrus and salt, or salt and citrus if you want to take it in order. So when you have a wine like any of these three wines from Monção and Melgaço that are citrusy and saline, it's the natural foil. And don't be afraid of letting these stand up to things that are traditionally red wine pairings, because Monção and Melgaço will play well.
Yeah, I go in the direction of spice and heat. You know, spice and heat can knock out a wine, and if the wine has tannin or oak, man, you have just a train wreck on your hands here. But dishes with either, I don't know, sriracha or hot chilies, or lots of, you know, Indian or Asian spices need these sort of piercingly racy, clean wines that then sort of cut like a sushi knife through all those spice and heat flavors. So I love that because I think not many wines can do that. So that's where I would be.
I'm with you.
All right.
This reminded me of the classic every Spanish restaurant or modern American restaurant, the fried shishito peppers with sea salt, right? And maybe some fresh lime. These are the wines for those.
There you go. All right. So let's see. We've talked about all three wines. We've talked about how important Alvarinho is. I definitely hope that everyone will add Monção and Melgaço to their repertoire of wines that they enjoy all the time, because certainly for these wines, price is not a barrier. My goodness. You almost want to say, you could charge more, guys, except the consumer in you says, all right, never mind, do not charge more. We have a question coming in, though, from Brenda, which is, do any of these wines does Alvarinho, in fact, fall within the concept of the aromatic varietals? And Brenda, that's a pretty good techie question there. The historic aromatic varieties, the top four anyway, are Riesling, Gewürztraminer, Muscat, and Viognier. Everybody agrees on those. But Erik, would you put Alvarinho in the second set of aromatic varieties?
I wouldn't, but I want to be clear that's not a disparagement of Alvarinho. So for me, I will tell you, when I was early on in my sommelier career and struggling with blind tasting, the three wines that I could virtually never tell apart, I'm talking classic representations of these varieties, were Alvarinho, Gruner Veltliner, and Pinot Grigio, because similarly structured, similar acidity, almost all have some sort of herbaceous or vegetal or some sort of background non-fruit component. And so for me, I can remember like having glasses of all three in front of me and saying out loud, this is Alvarinho, this is Gruner Veltliner, this is Alvarinho. I'm just doing this for hours to try to understand it. So I wouldn't consider these aromatic, but I think it's important to note that me as a sommelier, my definition of aromatic might be a little bit different than a consumer. And moreover, I think there's a correlation between aromatic varieties and complexity that is misunderstood. We tend to think of the most complex wines as not complex. I'll give you an example. If you smell a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, most people will be like, oh, that's definitely New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, therefore it's not that complex. No, it's because New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc is so complex that you can smell it and know this is what it is. So when I think about aromatics and complexity, I actually think of it in a converse way maybe than most people do. So that's a long way of saying, Brenda, no, I don't consider this a highly aromatic variety, but I don't think it's a non-aromatic variety. Things like Melon de Bourgogne, the variety of Muscadet, for instance, Loire Valley. To me, that's not a very aromatic variety. In fact, when I'm blind tasting, it's like, I don't really taste a lot, but I get some acid and some structure. I'm like, oh, it's probably Melon, right? This to me is like sort of in the middle.
Yeah, Brenda, I get where your question is coming from, because I think there should be kind of a second tier, not as aromatic as Riesling, Viognier, Gewürztraminer, or Muscat, but certainly whites in particular that take a lot of their character from the beauty of their aromatics. And I might put into that set Gruner Veltliner, which Erik just mentioned, Sauvignon Blanc, Alvarinho. It'd be interesting to maybe you should do it, Brenda, set up a set of, sort of descending varieties in terms of their how much aromatics play in their first impression. Robin is asking, are there also red Vino Verdes, and can you share about the reds? I'm going to, Erik, let you take this, but I just want to say first that the very first time I had red Vino Verde was like it was like 1979, and I was 2, but somehow I was in a truck stop in Portugal, And people were, not people, truck driver people who were drinking something. It was like, I don't know, 9 a.m. They were drinking something out of white bowls. And I thought, you know, being the the writer, I'll have one of those, I say. And the bar guy looks at me like, no, you won't, lady. I can't forget. Because I'm thinking, okay, it's like some special Portuguese coffee or something. Anyway, it turned out to be red Vino Verde. I persisted. He gave me a taste. I thought, wow, red Vino Verde is different today. And it's not a truck stop wine. You go now.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that. The first time I had red Vino Verde or Vino Verde Tinto, I was at a Tasca, and Tasca is like the Portuguese, like local mom and pop. Like the owner is probably the cook or it's his mom. They're also, you know, the servers, the dishwashers, the everything, right? Like the Tasca is like the quintessential, like, you know, like grilled sardines and like just like very local, rustic in the best way possible. And the first time I had Vino Verde Tinto, it was at a Tasca. The water was poured in the wine glass. The wine was poured in a little coffee cup.
Yeah.
I guess that's just how they do it. So yes, red Vino Verde is a thing. It's not the most common. It doesn't see a lot of export. It's typically based on the grape variety called casta. So the Portuguese term for grape variety is casta. Espadero. By the way, if I'm mispronouncing anything, anyone who's Portuguese, please correct me. But Espadero is one of the most important red grapes of Vino Verde Tinto. Also Padeiro, Alvarinho, different than Alvarinho, Borraçal, Vinhão, Amaral. These are all like indigenous Portuguese red varieties that you do see in Vino Verde Tinto. But the reality is, and I don't know the exact statistic, but from an export standpoint, I don't think I've ever seen a red Vino Verde in the United States. Not saying they don't exist here, but in terms of production, Vino Verde is like something like 92, 93, 94% white, maybe more. You'll have to fact check me on this. But Monção and Melgaço, because of how well Alvarinho does there, is like 98, 99% red. If I'm not mistaken, I might be off by a couple percentages, so please fact check me.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think most of the Monção and Melgaço wines in the United States and the Vino Verde wines in the United States are white. And, you know, I have to say, as someone who drinks white wine every single day, there may be a little bit of a white wine bias in this country. You hear people say sometimes, oh, red wine, you know, I think, yeah, I love too. But that line, that beautiful form of a really exquisite white wine is, you only get that in white wine. So those of us who love wine, I guess, have to love both styles. But when it comes to Vino Verde, Monção and Melgaço, I'm in the white camp. All right, Erik, it has been great to talk to you as always. You're so fun to talk with, my friend. Thank you for taking time out and discussing these wines with me. We both hope lots of people taste them more because they're really worthy of a little love here, of attention, of purchasing. I promise you won't be disappointed. So for me, thank you so much. And Erik, thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll see everyone next time on Taste with Karen Live. I'm Karen McNeil. Thank you.